Hey, my name's Kelvin, and I'm a level designer. I've been in level design for about 8 years, and these are some of the things that I'd like to work on going into 2025. None of the stuff that I'll be talking about will be breaking NDA, so don't expect any secrets from me. Now, the first one is to be more specific. Now, the thing with being more specific is that it is just part of our jobs. Designers are constantly day to day looking at sort of the abstract idea or sort of a higher level concept, and we have to break it down into rules. If we want this sort of experience, what rules would guide us there closer to that experience? And we test and we hypothesize, and then we test, and then we see how that's translating. But sometimes, and I have noticed this with myself, is that I get a little stuck. In particular, something that tends to happen is when we feel a little bored in a space and we're not really sure what to do. It's just kind of, it's like placeholder. And someone kind of says, like, me included, let's make it more engaging. Let's make the space more interesting. And it's a very, like, it makes sense. It's just like, if it's a flat area, we should add something to it, right? But the thing is, it doesn't always have to. Take, for example, a map in Battlefield 1. Set in World War One, you would expect a lot of trenches. And in World War One, we know from reference art and things that we've worked on that the trenches tend to overlook an area in the middle called a no man's land. And no man's land is intentionally very empty and limiting of options, and that's what makes it a no man's land. And you can see how, if you're looking to build a map that is featuring trench warfare, that suddenly, if the feedback you're getting in the no man's land is, oh, it's very hard to cross, you should make the space more interesting because it's just empty. You can see how there's an inherent conflict there, right? You have the no man's land desired experience, but you also have the fact that, yeah, crossing the middle sometimes is just going to be flat land. When we give the feedback of make the space more interesting, we are also assuming the designer's intent with the space, that it needs to be an interesting space in the first place. And that's what makes players drawn towards it. But sometimes the fact is a flat space could cause players to be averse to it. And maybe that's actually the other level designer's intentions. The next thing in general is just telling someone to make it more engaging. The thing with engagements is it's kind of a harder thing to define than you might realize. And oftentimes it's almost synonymous with make it good. And while engagement and making it good is in general our design philosophy, it also just helps to not start with, I'm going to make an engaging level, but rather, I'm going to make a level that has this type of gameplay and supports these sorts of decisions for players that make it unique to other levels. And from there, if you're specific enough, then you can start testing as to whether or not your map is meeting those specific goals, as opposed to, is the map engaging? I hope that makes sense, and hopefully I've explained myself pretty well here, but in general, yeah, being more specific with feedback, trying to understand designer intent before giving that feedback, something that I do want to work on in my professional career this year. The next thing is to be more intention with the choices that I offer the player in my space. Has this ever happened to you when you're playing a game and you're somehow in a position where as soon as you look out, you're overwhelmed with the amount of options that you're given and you're not really sure how to proceed, which direction to go, which direction is better, and oddly enough, despite the amount of choices that you have, you don't have the information necessary to decide whether or not going one way is any more better or important than the other way. I think it's a trap that some level designers fall into, and it's something that I personally have in the past, which is just automatically assuming that offering players choices at any given moment is good. Like in school, sometimes we're taught that, oh, player choice is a good thing to have. And we should offer the player choices because they can make choices in the world, and that's good inherently. I think the thing to remember about offering player choices is that if you don't give them the feedback on how to make an informed decision between two choices, you know, if they all they have is these two doors and they look the exact same and you're telling them, "Hey, pick one of these doors to go through. One will kill you, one will give you an advantage." But you have no information other than the fact that it's one of those two doors. It's no different than getting the player to flip a coin and having them decide. And that's a really odd way to reward slash punish players because even though they've made a choice, left or right, it's not really a choice so much as a coin flip, really. And in designing levels, if you imagine a single player shooter mission where there's a straight path where you see a bunch of enemies in front of you, right? A trap that you might have is, oh, the player needs some choice to deal with that encounter. So I'm just going to add a high ground path. And there, now the player has choice. Well, in shooters, traditionally, the high ground is a much better position to have. And so is that really a choice when you've created the option to take the enemies on head front or to just be in an advantageous position? There's no tension in that decision. Players are just going to go up to the high ground every single time because it's just necessarily better for combat. Of course, it is a generalization, so to speak, depending on your combat mechanics, abilities, blah, 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 blah. But you kind of get the idea. If the player is given a choice, but one of the choices is clearly better, they're just going to take that. And this applies for designing competitive maps. It applies to balancing game modes. Players in general will just take the path of least resistance to accomplish their objective. And so if the ways that they have to accomplish that objective are not equally feasible options, but rather options, an option that is just much better than the other, they're only going to go for, the main option. And you can see how this, in combination with the previous point on getting too much feedback on making a space engaging or interesting, you could just transform an area into something that just has way too much stuff going on. And as a result, lose the spatial identity, lose the relationship between the space and the gameplay, as well as, yeah, well, you get the idea. So, to recap the second point, it's to be intentional with the choices that you offer the player and why that choice is there, and understanding why you would make that choice more than other choices, and to make sure that the other choices are also just as valid. Of course, this isn't a hard rule, and there are certainly some games that do benefit from just overwhelming the player with choices. Open world games with creative tools come to mind. But I would say that in general, you still want to have an understanding of the opportunities that the player has to enter, let's say, a combat encounter or to engage in a space, and to be comfortable with sometimes the fact that the choices are limited and that can be used to create interesting gameplay by itself. The third thing that I would like to do more of in 2025 is to use more references. Now, I'm no stranger to using references and concept art and all of that for my spaces, but I think something that tends to get overlooked, especially in student and more junior projects that I've seen at least, is when you have the vision of a space and you're gathering references for it, is to figure out what makes that environment or biome or level unique, and sort of through those references search for something that can help you make that gameplay that's unique to that area stand out. I think something that would have happened in the past is if I was told to make a level in a forest, I would search up a bunch of forests and I would, you know, look at terrain and the undulation and, look at natural features like caves and like slopes and hills and plateaus and all the natural features that come with working in a forest. But I think now I would be looking at a forest in the context of what are like the gameplay opportunities that come with the forest? when I think of a forest, what am I associating that forest with? And in the context of whatever game, it could be something like using the verticality. Maybe in the world, there are bridges or people living inside the trees. Maybe inside the trees, there's, honey, and that's like a cool mechanic. Or in the context of Minecraft, forests come with a lot of wood. Whereas when you're in a science fiction lab, there are technology things that you can always interact with, doors that open and close really suddenly. And that can also be used to justify gameplay that you can't necessarily get in a forest area. I think every map that you work on, especially if it's sort of a standalone thing, we know that a map in general needs sort of this hook, this thing that sort of is even more specific than just the area that you're fighting in. It needs to have some sort of additional level of drama or storytelling that sort of makes it more memorable in everyone's mind. One example that comes to mind is for the opening mission of Mass Effect 3, which I studied for my interview at BioWare, is that the Reapers are attacking Earth. And the Reapers are blowing stuff up. And you're walking through the mission, and all of a sudden, buildings will explode in front of you from a Reaper's laser, right? You're going about your business near the end of the mission, and suddenly the platform that you're on collapses again due to Reaper attacks. You're walking down the space, and even though it's kind of on rails, you're seeing human alliance ships blow up in front of you. And all of that is serving to add to the experience that you're in a very dangerous area and you're on areas that aren't necessarily meant for combat because you're kind of just escaping. But you sort of have that additional hook of like, yeah, the Reapers are invading Earth, and you get to experience that as a player. Imagine if that first mission said that Reapers were invading Earth and you need to get to your spaceship. A mission where you're just on Earth walking to a spaceport is not very interesting. And you could have Reapers in the background, but because they're not actually doing anything to your gameplay space, they just look like Vista elements. The fact is, when BioWare intentionally made those Reapers get into your face, it ups the stakes a lot more for you as a player, and it makes the mission more memorable. I know that necessarily doesn't really tie into the whole gather more references thing, but in general, I do feel like once you're able to gather more references outside of just the biome, but also gameplay experiences and elements, then I think you have a higher chance of finding that hook that is unique to your level and to your play space, and as such is the thing that makes you that makes the level a lot more memorable. And so when I gather references this year for the projects that I plan on working on, I really want to emphasize the gameplay hooks to make that space really stand out and come to life in a way that isn't possible with other types of spaces in the same game. So to recap the third point, use more references and have it help you understand the gameplay and unique hooks and potential that your level and space have. Really draw that out of it, as opposed to just sort of looking at purely from an artistic or from a terrain / what it's supposed to feel like perspective. I know none of this is particularly insightful for you level designers out there, especially the more experienced ones. I know that it's not anything new, use more reference art, just be more specific with your language. But in particular, those three are some of the traps that I tend to fall into when I'm slightly unsure of how to proceed, and I sort of get hung up on these things. And I think going into this new year, as I work on the stuff that I work on, I think there's some potential to be a bit more specific, use more reference art, and to, what was the second one? Be intentional with the choices that I offer the player. That was it. Anyways, thanks for watching. Let me know if you want to hear more game design content from me, because to be honest, I like talking about it. And while I know, again, it's not particularly insightful or new, it's still something that I'd like talking about. Yeah. All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.